what is in your perspective the single most valuable idea on Earth right now?
Well, I mean, I think I have to go with this thing that's been the focus of my career, which is this idea that our biggest problem is failing to aggregate information. And we do know of an institution that does a great job of that. If only we could do more small scale trials to show that it works to spread it to larger uses. We have a biggest problem that we know how to solve. If only we would explore and develop that solution.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful idea, and one I hope to explore personally, but also understand much more about. Okay, awesome. So, Professor, I wanted to understand a little bit about your upbringing and where it is that you grew up. You mind telling me where it is that you were born and what your sort of background was in that sense?
Born in Illinois, 1959, Wheaton, which is a pretty rural area near Chicago. I was a, nerdy kid. We moved from Chicago to San Diego around second grade for me. Story is that my dad was an IRS agent in Chicago and brought in the wrong client, prosecuted the wrong case against the wrong organized crime, and so had to leave the area to avoid retribution for prosecuting organized crime. And so he had to start a whole new career, and he did. He became a computer programmer in 1969, roughly, very early days, in San Diego, where he also on the side was a pastor of a church as a part-time thing.
Okay, so that's that's very shocking to me. So he went from being a prosecutor to being a programmer and was simultaneously a pastor at the same time as being a programmer.
Yeah, my mother and my father were both, religious and did various revival meeting events while we were in Illinois. And actually, I have two brothers, and we were a little choir as part of the revival meeting thing. So we had matching little suits and would sing in a little choir as the kids.
And you said religion. If you don't mind me asking, what religious background?
It was Southern Baptist.
Interesting. And what I'm not sure how well attuned you are, but I don't know much about Southern Baptist. I grew up in an evangelical Christian background and spent much of my life sort of in that background.
So it's a lot of energetic fire and brimstone sort of, preaching.
Okay.
So it's not, one of those sort of reserved upper class sort of churches. It's a very energetic lower class, religion.
Okay.
My parents met at Wheaton, which is a college, a Christian college. And then when I was 1 year old, I was on the way back from Australia, which is where my parents had gone as missionaries, taking me with them when I was an infant.
Oh, wow. And how long did you spend in Australia?
I guess about a year.
Oh, wow. And so you don't remember much of it?
Of course, I don't at that age, but.
Have you been back since?
No. Oh, I've been back, but I, of course, made no contacts with anybody. My parents made contacts with anybody.
So, okay. So you moved from Illinois to San Diego because your dad became a programmer, because he had to flee from sort of the case that he had with the IRS, given the fact that there was this organized crime group, which is, I'm sure, a story on its own. What happened sort of after San Diego? Did you just grow up?
So we lived in San Diego. I grew up there. And I went to up through high school there, and then we moved from there up into Tustin, which is in Orange County, north of San Diego. And I went to high school in Tustin. And then I went to college early in 1977.
What's early?
That is a year and a half early, I guess, before. Okay. And then I started college early there because it was the local college. And I didn't really know, or my parents didn't know, or somebody didn't know to apply to other colleges because we just went to the local college. I don't know if I would have gotten in elsewhere or what would have happened, but Irvine was a little easy for me. And so I spent a lot of time just making up my own stuff to figure out and study.
And what were you interested in? So did your dad sort of move into programming and sort of inspire you in any way? Was that something that motivated you to do
I had
something?
an inspirational high school teacher, like in the sophomore year of high school, who taught me physics. And then the striking thing about physics was just he wasn't asking me to believe things just because he said so, that we did these experiments in class to test the things he said. And that was a revelation to me, that I didn't have to just believe what they told me. And so I got into physics as a thing I could believe. And so then I went into engineering initially in college because I thought I wanted to be engineering, but the engineering school I was at was very cookbook and I wanted to understand things. So I switched to physics to understand formulas. So I
Right.
was skeptical in that sense. I needed to be convinced. And then, so in college, the physics program was set up into two sets of 2 years. Basically, I guess it was a quarter system. So there were 6 topics that you would do. And then the first 2 years, you would do each of those 6 topics. And the second 2 years, you do all the same topics again, but with more math. And once we started to do the topics again with more math, I wasn't happy because I wanted to understand the concepts, not to start doing more math. So I, at that point, stopped doing the homework and just played with the equations all semester, just rearranged them, tried them out. And then I could ace the exams, having understood things by rearranging the equations. But then my professors would have to decide what to do with their grade formula, which of course required that I do the homework.
Yeah.
But I aced the exams. So, they had a mixed response to that.
Oh, that must have been pretty baffling for them. So you, in some sense, refused to play the academic game.
At that point, I decided to take control of my learning. Already, I had been like just doing a lot of projects on my own where I tried to figure things out on my own without outside of class. And then at that point, I decided to take more time for that.
Were you driven to that sort of because you had these deep philosophical questions of your own, or were you just somewhat
I
curious?
just wanted to understand.
Okay.
And the way to understand was to keep playing and rearranging them in order to figure out what they said and what they meant and what they implied. I wanted to make sense of them.
Did you have people around you that were very similar? Were your friends very
Not
similar?
really. I
No.
mean, I was very nerdy, of course, and there was like a physics club, and I could go to the physics club and meet other people. I was so nerdy that I was just terrified of ever talking to women. And so I didn't, except in the physics club, it was in physics mode talking about physics and didn't notice or care that they were women. And then those women, I could make a connection with because we were talking physics, not male, female. And, that's how perhaps I overcame my terror of talking to women.
That's fascinating. And so, okay, so you went, and what was the specific college that you went to? Irvine?
Or UC Irvine, yes.
UC Irvine, okay. And then you sort of went into engineering. Engineering wasn't really what you wanted it to be.
It didn't help me understand enough. That as I thought I wanted to just build and design things. I love the idea of making things and designing things. And I still do that to some extent, but I wasn't willing to make and design things without understanding the principles I was supposedly using, and that distracted me from designing.
And so you moved into physics. And does that mean you majored in physics at the time?
Right. I majored in physics. And then
Okay.
along the way, toward the end, I had further questions in the sense that there was this science thing and people kept talking about what it was, and it never made that much sense. What is science exactly? And why is it a good thing? And why is it different than other things? And so those questions made me want to go into philosophy of science. So I asked some philosophers at Irvine about these questions. They said, oh, well, you want to do philosophy of science or even conceptual foundations of science, which is what they did at University of Chicago. So that's why I applied and went to University of Chicago to study conceptual foundations of science. So it was a interdisciplinary program in conceptual foundations of science. And they required you to get a master's in a field of science in order to get their PhD in conceptual foundations. So then I was taking physics classes and taking the philosophy classes at the same time. And then in a sense, I answered the questions I had for myself about philosophy of science. So then I moved back toward physics.
Interesting. What were sort of the questions that you had at the time? What were the things that you
Well, those are
felt
the
like
questions. As I said, what is science? Why is it? How is it different than other things? What is the source of its power?
and do you want to detail what some of the answers that you found to
Well,
that were?
the answer is there is no such thing as science. There is nothing. It doesn't exist. There are just lots of different fields who have different methods for doing things. And this, I was just lied to, that saying there is this magic science thing that answers questions. There isn't.
So and sometimes I like to think of science, and perhaps this is a very brash way of putting it, as perhaps a more intellectually driven, organized religion of sorts. Would that framing be accurate to you?
It's a community with a brand, and it's highly respected. And so they want to protect the brand and protect the respect the brand gets by supporting each other and criticizing outsiders and holding members to a high standard of membership so that they can continue with their prestigious brand. They don't actually have much in the way of beliefs in common, other than we're good and whatever we say is right. But they're all split across lots of disciplines who say lots of different things. There's not really
And
much
what did it
thing they
feel
say
like?
in common, other than science is great and you should trust science, whatever that is.
Yeah. Given it has a lot of authority these days, but what was it like sort of, I mean, I know University of Chicago is a pretty prestigious institution. What was it like to sort of be amongst the minds that went to that school at the time? And this was you getting your PhD, or what were you getting? Was it just a master's at the time?
Well, like I said, I was in a PhD program for conceptual foundations of science, and that required me to get a master's in the field of
Yeah.
science. So I
Yeah.
started that. But then once I decided that I'd answered the questions in conceptual foundations, I switched to a PhD program in physics.
In physics. And then you
But
moved
but
to,
then soon later I read about cool stuff happening in Silicon Valley. And so I decided to leave grad school entirely and take my 2 masters in conceptual foundations of science and physics and go off to Silicon Valley to do cool stuff there.
okay. You went to Silicon Valley, and how long
This was in 1984.
okay.
So I started grad school in 81 and did 3 years there, and went then to, and so I read in the library, always reading lots of things, and I saw these articles about artificial intelligence. The guy named Douglas Lennon was doing exciting stuff. He was in Stanford and Silicon Valley. That was a reason to go there. And then I read these other stuff by Ted Nelson and others about hypertext publishing, and that was always exciting. And those people were also in Silicon Valley. So those 2 things together, I decided to head off to Silicon Valley and join these exciting ventures. Now, what I didn't know is Doug Lennon was leaving at that same moment to go to Texas. So I never overlapped with him there, but I did just get a job in an artificial intelligence group by basically, I got a job at Lockheed, and then I switched within a year to the artificial intelligence group. So apparently my physics background was impressive to them, and that let me get in there. And on the side, I worked with the hypertext publishing people.
And I'm guessing you weren't programming, right? What was your sort
I started,
of role?
yes, I became programming, yes. But I just programmed by learning a program. Hadn't had very much academic background in that.
And what were you guys using back then? What languages?
Lisp was the main artificial intelligence language back in 1984. And for my next 9 years of AI research, Lisp was my main language.
Lisp is almost an ancient language now. It's
yeah,
I don't know.
It's still good.
Yeah, one of the best. One of the best. And so you spent 9 years working for this artificial intelligence group inside Lockheed.
Well, I spent 4.5 years in Lockheed, and then I was switched to NASA, which was nearby, NASA Ames, and also doing in the AI group. But I sort of really did Bayesian statistics there.
And what was the nature of the work that you guys worked on?
Well, at NASA, for example, one of the first projects was a thing for automatically classifying things, but we applied it to stars. So they had a bunch of new star data with new infrared telescopes. And so we could use our automated Bayesian statistics mechanism to classify stars into the stars that the data would cluster into. And then we also did the first super resolution. I don't know if you know this, but many cameras today have multiple basically places where the image goes onto a chip to record it, but they have multiple of them, and then they do what's called super resolution. That is, take multiple images that are slightly offset from each other to make one higher resolution image. So if you move the camera around, then each pixel varies as it moves around, and you can take multiple pictures that are slightly offset to make one higher resolution camera. And so we were the first to do that back then.
Interesting. That's remarkable. Was that something you enjoyed working on?
Well, sure. I mean, I on the team was the guy who did the math mainly. That was my role. I did the Bayesian statistics math. I also did coding, but there were other people in the project who were better coders than I, but I certainly coded part of it. But I did the math that does it, and other people were like the big conceptual people or whatever. But so that's how I kept my math alive. And then when I went back to school, one of the problems many people who go back to school late have is their math has gotten rusty. And I was in a pretty math intensive program that I went back to, but because I had been doing math the whole time, that allowed me to pick up and continue with math in school.
Right. And so what was the time period in which you were at NASA Ames? Was that in the 1970s or 80s?
So again, I started in 84. I left grad school at Chicago at 84. And then I was in Silicon Valley till 93. Right. And then the last 4.5 years of that would be at NASA from say 89 to 93.
Interesting. And did you at all during that time come across a mat known as Creon Levitt?
Doesn't sound familiar to me, but tell me more. What is Creon doing then?
Yes, so Creon was he was the head of the large data analytics group at NASA Ames for some time, and he ran a couple labs there. He worked on some heretical science. He now is part of the Foresight Institute. I'm not sure if you're.
I am associated with the Foresight Institute. Have been for a long time.
So he's a member there. I think he's one of the founding members actually of Foresight. Interesting character.
I'm surprised I haven't come across him then.
Yeah,
Leon
that's why.
Lovett. Okay.
Yeah, I thought you might have run across him. So interesting. So you moved. So I'm guessing you moved from NASA Ames then to Caltech.
Right. So I basically spent 2 years at Lockheed, full time, getting into the AI center. And then after 2 years, I decided I wanted to downgrade from 40 hours a week to 30 so I could spend more time on my own stuff. And which I did. They were willing to go for that. They basically said, well, you're not going to get promoted anymore. You're obviously giving up on the whole promotion route, but sure, we'll keep you. And then I could just focus on my own stuff. And so that's what I did more. And, that worked until later when we started to have babies. My wife and I, at which point my wife was saying, no, you need to be working full time for having babies.
Reasonable. Seems reasonable. So you were at Caltech while also being at Lockheed at the time.
So we switched from Lockheed to Caltech. Sorry. I switched from, first I was at Lockheed, then I was at NASA, and then in 1993 I left to go to Caltech. Then I was at full time at Caltech at that point. They were geographically separate. That is, Caltech's down in Southern California. My jobs were up in Northern California.
Right. And so you had 2 years at Caltech. And what were you doing at the time? What were you?
So I got a PhD at Caltech. So it was a 4 years in your out program. So I finished the PhD in 4 years at Caltech from 93 to 97. And that was an intensive, hardworking period. So the whole concept was I had on the side developed this interest and hobby in institution design, in thinking about stuff on my own. This wasn't for NASA or Lockheed. And I wanted to make this hobby into a career. And I read a paper in Science about experimental economics, about how economists were using lab experiments to find out which institutions worked better. That appealed to me. That's why I went to Caltech, is to join a group doing experimental economics, because I wanted to test institution ideas. What I didn't realize is that the economists had a rule that you should only test institutions that you have a game theory model of. So I didn't have game theory models of most of the institutions I wanted to test. And so I learned the math enough to make models of things. And that distracted me from actually testing them with lab experiments, because that's a whole other thing to be doing.
And what is, I mean, you said something, you said a number of things there that I find extremely fascinating. What's institution design?
So we are part of many institutions in our world. That is, just like the world has physical structures like roads and cars and things like that, we sit inside social structures, organizations, but also things like voting or markets, etc. And there's a space of possible structures. And just like innovation in the physical world is coming up with new structures and testing them that work better, there's innovation in the social world coming up with new institutional structures working better, new ways to vote, new ways to give incentives to workers, new ways to organize things, new ways to buy products and services. There's just a whole world of better ways to do things. And that intrigued me because, when I thought about problems in the world previously, I often realized that technical problems were often less the problem than social problems. There were many technical solutions that were blocked by social problems. And so I realized, oh, I want to solve the social problems. Let's go figure out how to make those better.
That's an interesting approach, perhaps the right one. What are some of the complexities that you have to deal with when trying to do something like institutional design? I know you mentioned that there's different facets to it, but what are some of the ways in which you go about it?
Well, it's a lot like, say, physical design, in the sense that what you first need is just a concept, a thing that makes sense. And then there's ways to critique it conceptually, to have people talk about what they're worried about, what might happen, maybe work through some arguments for why, work through variations that might reduce some of the problems people are pointing to. So you want to just first have a concept and then work out a conceptual design that might at least address some of the problems that people might be worried about. Once you have a conceptual design, then, in academia, then you might test it out in, say, a math model to see how it works there, or maybe a computer simulation. And then if it passed those tests, you might do a lab experiment to see how well it works in the lab. And if that works well, you might try a field experiment where other people in the real world are using it. And you would start with trials in the real world that are small scale, relatively transparent, cheap, that you could try variations. But once something works on a small scale, then what you want to do is get people to try it on larger scales. And eventually, if small scale leads to medium scale, leads to large scale, then you finally have something working in the world that's giving people value, because you went through this whole path of getting a concept and trying it out.
So in some sense, and you can correct me if I've understood this wrongly, institutional design is just creating a formalized scientific methodology by which you build institutions, much the same way you would take something from fundamental research to a product.
Well, so if we think about engineering and science, so somebody may, for example, have a concept for a better kind of material, and then they would try to make that material, and then they would do some lab tests of the material, and maybe some field tests of the material, and then try to get companies to make it scale massively on scales in order to sell it to people. Science doesn't have to be part of that process at all. We can have innovation in engineering without science at all. Well, all we really need is an idea and a way to test it and a way to vary it until we get something that works, and then we scale it up. But scientists do often have ideas for things. That is, you can use science to generate a concept. You can also use science to test ideas in terms of having more academically impressive, validated statistical or experimental tests. But you don't have to. And then science, of course, wants to take credit for everything. But in fact, most innovation in the world doesn't have much to do with science. And without science, we probably have nearly as much innovation as we do now. But science can help, although science often just takes a lot of money and then doesn't help and then takes credit for stuff.
That's that's so you're saying in some sense the science of institutional design is just legitimizing the idea as a whole rather than being necessary in its creation.
But so science is a name for, I guess, two different kinds of things. Sometimes science is just the name for the set of theories and understandings we have of things. Another way, science is just an institution by which people publish papers and get credit and follow official procedures. It's that second part I'm saying you don't have to do. I mean, you do need to have some conceptual theories about how things work in order to generate concepts for how to make them better. But, it doesn't have to take the form of, a formal mathematical model necessarily, or other sort of formal scientific theory. It can just be a concept of how things work.
Okay. So I think this is probably an interesting place to take a tangent. We'll get back to sort of your life and build up from Caltech, but institutional design for me sort of points at something that's going on right now in our world, and that's sort of something that a lot of people have started doing is thinking about how it is that we can transform global governance through systems like decentralized blockchain ecosystems. Is there any way that you feel as if institutional design and sort of the blockchain ecosystem that's emerging right now are somewhat correlated things?
So the general problem in institution design is something I didn't realize, and it's different from the design of physical devices or even software. So in the world of physical devices or software, there's a lot of people eager for better designs and a lot of investment money waiting to throw itself at better ideas for designs. And then most ideas for better designs are pursued aggressively with a lot of money. And then when they work, they produce businesses that have a lot of activity and money. So there's just a lot of people working hard to find better physical device and software designs. The reason I went into social science designs was it seemed to me easier to come up with better designs in economics and social science than it was in physics and software. At least to me, and I took that initially as saying, I must be a genius at this stuff, because look how easy it is for me to come up with better designs here. This ought to be, I ought to be here, okay? What I didn't realize is the best explanation for why it's so easy to come up with social science designs relative to physical device science is just the world doesn't pursue them very much. Many people come across the same design over and over again, and then the world never pursues any of them. And that's why it's so easy to find those designs. The world just doesn't care. So there is very little money or energy in pursuing ideas for social designs. And there's little interest in trying them out or adopting them. And that's a big puzzle about social design. Why is there so little interest there? But that's an obstacle, of course, to my hope to make the world better by coming up with better designs and getting them adopted. So that's just the general fact about institution design. Now, there are some particular contexts where people might be more interested in making it. That is, one kind of social design is how do you pay the manager of an organization to get them to put more work into things, say incentive contracts for managers. So there's more effort and interest in that than there are most social designs. But honestly, mostly there's just little interest. Now, the blockchain is a world where a bunch of people decided that they're going to make a whole new world, a completely different world. And eventually they're going to connect it to the existing world, but they're not in any rush to do that. So most of the activity there is making tools and platforms to help other people in that world make more tools and platforms. And only a minor effort into actually like serving final customers with blockchain stuff. And, it's not clear they're actually going to succeed at that, but that's the whole vision. So in that vision, they're interested in making new designs for tools and platforms that could plausibly serve customers. And part of that is the social design, but it's only interested in if blockchain is part of it. And they're not really interested if it's not blockchain part of it. And then they're really only interested in, of course, in a social design such that they could sell a product plausibly to some customer eventually, although they don't actually check if they do actually sell the product. They're just mostly happy to have a story about how that might work.
that's a that's a very seems like a very accurate perspective. But do you feel as if it's at least a way in which we could scale some of these experiments,
Well,
social
it's a
science
place where people
experiments?
are coming up with ideas for things and then, developing them. Of course, the whole point is what we really need is in the actual rest of the world, people to use stuff. And there's usually relatively little interest in trying out new institutions in general. And there's also a little interest in trying out new blockchain stuff too. But there is this whole world of investment that's gone into blockchain. So they've at least had a lot of money thrown at stuff there. It's mostly, of course, based on software that's built on blockchain. So most institution design doesn't need much software. And most software doesn't need much blockchain.
That's very true.
But nevertheless, there is a bunch of people throwing a lot of money at blockchain and looking for things to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so speaking of institution design, what are some of the institutions you feel, I mean, given sort of the world we live in today and the degree to which a lot of institutions have decayed, what are some of the institutions you feel are most critical to, in some sense, either reinvent or reinvigorate with new
Well,
ideas?
since we have limited time here, let me just start straight out with what I think my best idea is. And that's the idea that's going after the most general problem we have. So the most general problem we have is how do we combine what different people know or could know into a consensus estimate of consequences of choices. That is, if we do something, what's the consequence? That is, we have many people who have ideas for how to change things, but we don't have a way to pull what everybody knows together to make an overall evaluation of those ideas. That's the fundamental problem. If we had a way to do that, then we could just keep adopting changes as people invented them, and then we rapidly make a much better world, right? The fundamental problem isn't that we don't have ideas. The problem is we don't know how to combine what we know into a consensus estimate of the relative promises of different ideas. So we have a straightforward mechanism to answer that question and to achieve that result, which is betting markets. We can make betting markets on particular consequences of our choices and directly get estimates of which choices are better. And betting markets do a good job of integrating information into consensus estimates. And that's not just in theory. We have a lot of data showing that betting markets do better than comparable institutions with similar resources on the same questions. And we have a lot of very concrete ideas about how we could use betting markets to get better answers to common important policy questions. What we don't have is a way to make anybody care about any of that. So that's, again, the fundamental problem about social institution design is that few people care. They just can't be motivated to care. And that's also true of even the best solution to solving the most fundamental problem. You can't get people to care.
Well, I mean, the idea that it's a betting market. So I think, okay, so we're now sort of getting into your sort of framework of prediction markets, I'm guessing.
Right.
And surprisingly, this is something that I've been thinking about, not knowing that you'd written several papers on this, and had been some of the loudest voice on this, is this idea that sort of ideas are a fundamental unit and they're sort of the building block of all innovation. And I've always thought of as betting as being a way in which we can gauge the value of an idea relative to another idea.
Right.
And then I assume that AI is going to play a very crucial role in this, in aggregating these ideas, given their, value. But you mentioned that the hard part is trying to get people to care about this. But I assume if you're betting on ideas, or if you're betting on these beliefs, then there's some implicit return that you can earn in the future if you're correct. So I'm assuming that's the incentive. Would that be correct?
So in the world of information, an information collecting institution would have buyers and sellers. On the one side would be sellers, people who have information or can get information, who could be enticed at a price to offer that information to other people. Those are the people who might bet in a betting market. Those are the buyers. I'm sorry, the sellers. But a market doesn't happen unless there are both sellers and buyers. So another crucial part has to be somebody who wants to know something and is willing to pay for it and offers to pay. And then that induces people on the other side to offer to sell. And then the matching produces an exchange of value. So the basic thing is that betting market, like a prediction market, is a place where buyers and sellers could meet, but it doesn't work if there's only the sellers there who want to sell the information. They just sell to each other, but they can't on average win. In order for the sellers to on average win, somebody has to be paying them, and that would be the buyers of information. That would be people subsidizing the betting markets in order to get answers to the questions. That's the thing we lack, of course, in addition to having laws that prohibit allowing the betting markets to happen at all. So in terms of public interactions, we just prevent betting markets by making them illegal. But many organizations could create private betting markets, and those would not be illegal, but they'd have to want them. An organization would have to say, oh, here's something we want to know. Will we make this deadline? What will the sales be? Which product design is better? If they were willing to say, we want to know this and pay for that, then they could get the information that betting market participants would supply if they were buyers willing to buy. But that's what we've lacked, is buyers willing to buy. So that's what I've said again. The key problem in institution design is getting anyone to care. And to care, you have to be willing to buy.
And so are there any approaches that you think might be able to solve that issue?
Well, first of all, legalizing would help, obviously. But the most straightforward thing is just we need small scale trials that give promising results that inspire other people to do larger scale trials. And so the approach we need is more small scale trials. Now, we've had quite a few trials already, but they are things of not close enough to the things that produce value. So imagine you were the first person to invent a motor, right? And you try to show the world, hey, motors are good. You want motors. Well, if you took your motors around and just attached them to random things like a tree or a blade of grass or a cat, and you would make the motors twirl these things, but those aren't actually very valuable uses for motors. You wouldn't inspire very many people to want to buy your motors by making a tree or a cat twirl with your motor. In order to inspire people to buy motors, you'd want a motor that was useful. You'd want to ask, where would motors be the most useful, such as making a boat go forward, or a motorcycle move, or lifting something to a higher height, right, that people weren't trying to lift in a mine, say. If you could apply a motor to something people valued, then you can inspire other people to also try motors out on other valuable things. So the same for prediction markets. It's a mechanism for buying information. If you just apply it to random topics nobody cares about, like celebrity divorces or sporting events or something like that, it's like applying a motor to a random cat or something. It's not actually showing people value being realized. It's just showing you can make stuff spin. And that doesn't inspire further efforts. So for prediction markets to progress, we need examples of value where somebody is applying them to a question they wanted to know the answer to, where the value of the answer they got was higher than the cost they put in to get the answer. And then they would want to do more of those things. And other people will want to do more things like those things. And then you could have an expanding wave of application like you would with motors. But unfortunately, the story with prediction markets usually is somebody like on blockchain says, hey, let's make prediction markets, and then just set up a piece of software that allows someone to ask a question and bet on it. And they say, bet on stuff. And people come in and say, oh, let me make up the celebrity divorce or this other thing. And we'll just bet with each other on it. And they'll do it for fun, but it's not a lot of value being created there. The value would be if somebody who had a question they wanted the answer to was willing to pay to answer the question. If somebody wanted to know a lot about a celebrity divorce, why, of course, they could offer to pay for that, and then the market could respond. But honestly, nobody cares that much about those things to pay much for them. But we have enormous numbers of actually valuable decisions in our society where it's worth a lot of money to get the answer. And that's what I would like people to try more examples of. So, for example, almost all organizations with, say, 20 people in them hire a couple of people new every year. Okay? They might hire 3 new people every year. And they might interview 12 people to get those 3 people. And the usual evaluation is it was a good hire if 2 years later we're giving them good performance evaluations. Okay? So you could just make a betting market for each of the 12 people you interview. What would their employee evaluation be 2 years later if we hired them? That is a market that's very valuable. Organizations care a lot about hiring the right people. And it's a structure that you could repeat over and over again for almost all organizations in the world. And if you could make a few organizations do that and show that they were getting values by having the organization be the buyer for the information that they want, and then other people are induced to participate to sell that information who are near the process, who can see the interviews, who know the organization, et cetera, then you could have a set of successful examples. And then you can get other people in other civil organizations to say, why don't we do that? Because that seems to be working for them. And then you could have a process that grows, that spreads, where people are achieving value. But that doesn't work if you just set up a market on a sporting events or a celebrity divorce or, some world events. Few people really care enough about those to be willing to pay much.
Right. It's funny because that somewhat strikes me as seemingly obvious, but I guess in some sense, prediction markets are also I guess they give off this very get rich quick sort of feeling. But how is it that you feel as if, how do we use prediction markets sort of in scientific research? Do you have any thoughts on how it might be useful?
Whenever you have it, so, if I were introducing motors in the world, I would not primarily say, how can scientists move stuff in the lab with motors? That's a small market. First, you go for big markets. After you run out of big markets, then you start searching for small markets you can still make a little more money on. Science is not the big market in the world for most products. Like if you had a light bulb, you wouldn't first go, well, how can we make a light bulb for scientists? Right? Or how can we make an air conditioner for scientists? You just say, how can we make a light bulb for anybody? And then if scientists want to buy it, fine.
So you're saying science is too niche of
yes, right. It's too niche to be introducing a whole new product category, especially for them. Once you've got it introduced for other people, sure, we have things we can do for them. But so if we turn the question around, though, and you say, what's the problem with science and how can we fix it? Then it turns out I would suggest a prediction market. But if you say, I want to start a prediction market business, what customer base should I go for first? I won't say scientists. I'll say, go for the biggest markets out there, like new hires, for example. Everybody needs new hires. That's valuable for everybody. Go for that. Don't even look at scientists as your first market for any new product.
Right. How about sort of, this might be somewhat stupid. I've seen prediction markets that are mainly focused on, I guess, just the latest news and what it is that's going on, what people want. I don't find value in those. I've tried to use them at times.
Right.
I know most of them. I'm on it for a couple seconds and I'm off. But I think something that I would find value in is sort of a generic platform where I know that people come to share whatever they consider to be the most valuable ideas. So not just news or just what's new and hot right now, but whatever they consider to be the most valuable idea at some point in time. I would love to see that because I would love to understand what the most valuable.
As you know, there already are many places where people come to share ideas. And in some sense, in their minds, they're sharing what they think are the most valuable ideas, but you want higher quality evaluation of that, right? So you really want some sort of communication environment where there's being very selective about things, but then you have to ask, well, what criteria do you want to select them for exactly? So, something like Twitter or news are selecting for popularity. How many people can they get to read this thing? If you wanted to read the most read article, then that should work very well for you. If that's not your criteria of the best idea, unfortunately, then you need to come up with another criteria for what you think consider to be the best ideas, such that we can build an institution around that.
Interesting. Yeah, agreed. But what would you say to people who say, I mean, you mentioned that there's not much value being given if you're just speculating on news. But someone might say, well, news is, I guess, in some sense, the most popular thing. And you mentioned earlier that you should go to the
No,
largest
but
distribution.
if you just look at our world as a whole, news is a pretty small industry. Sorry, it's not a major industry. News is a small industry. Okay. Major industries, what? There's food, there's transportation, there's housing, right? There's services. There's all sorts of large industries in our world, and all of those industries have important decisions they make all the time, that which they need information to make those decisions well. That's where most of the value of information in our world is. Most companies don't pay that much for news, nor should they. What they should pay more is to help decide when to build a new factory, how to construct a new machine, which customers are more interested in certain kinds of products. That's the world of valuable information that you sit in. If you want to make more valuable information in the world, those are the customers you should be trying to serve.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed. In what ways do you think artificial intelligence might play a role?
Artificial intelligence would be a substitute for human intelligence. So when you have artificial intelligence, then you can get more human intelligence, but you first want to ask, when is intelligence useful? So you just want to ask, what do we want to do? And then identify the parts of that. Sometimes being smarter helps. At the moment, without much AI, you just want to use smarter humans to do it. Later on, when you have AI, you use AI more to do that. But that's secondary to what do you want to do? And how are you going to do it?
Do you feel as if, in sort of taking some time to think about prediction markets a little bit, I find them to be somewhat of a obvious solution to sort of organizing information in hierarchies within AI systems. Because if you have a way in which you can say people have put bets on these different pieces of information, and they've gauged these as more valuable than others, then whatever AI system you're training on that information already has these weights in some sense, because people have bet on these different pieces of information. Do you feel as if it might help in even just like building more effective AI systems if they were trained on information from betting markets?
So the generic problem is, how does a buyer and a seller of information meet? A prediction market or a betting market is one answer to that question. It's an answer where the buyer can be agnostic about who's good as a seller. It's the key form. That is, in this sort of market, you don't have to decide who you want to buy from based on your estimate of their ability at various things. You can just set up this betting market and let them decide where to bet when, and you can just accept the overall price without judging quality. Now, in most interactions in the world, like within an organization, they don't want such an arm's length relationship. They are willing to make assumptions about who they trust, and then they just more assign people to do things and get answers, and then have a longer term process of trusting. So even within most computer systems or AI systems, the builder of the system makes a bunch of judgments about what process can be trusted and how they should be constructed, and then even what people should be assigned to develop which parts of the system, et cetera, in an organization. So in most production systems, the manager of the system is willing to and does make a lot of judgments about who's good, who's bad, and which approaches are appropriate. Sometimes you're in a situation where it's really hard to make those judgments, and you're better off having a relationship where you don't have to make it. So an auction, for example, is like that. When you hold an auction, all you have to do is hold the auction, and you will find who will be the auction winner. And then you can pick them, but you didn't have to make any prior judgment about who the auction winner was going to be. You could just hold the auction and invite anybody to join. So an auction is a process where you don't have to make judgments so much about who do you trust. And that's the kind of institution we economists often want to recommend to people. They're often so much in the habit of having an institution where they have to decide who to trust and who they will have a relationship with, that they're just in the habit of doing that for everything. They don't realize sometimes you can not trust. Sometimes you don't have to make those judgments. And in some sense, that's what markets often are for. That is, large impersonal markets are places where you can go buy stuff without having to know who the party is on the other side and knowing a lot about them to decide you trust them. So again, so it's the difference between an organization with parts that they have close relationships between, where they then trust the parts, and then more distant relationships of organizations where they don't trust each other and they don't know each other. So for an AI project, if you have a team making a project, then it's going to trust all the people in the team and know who it likes. And then those parts of the team will then be authorized to do various things based on that trust. But if you have a larger world and you have just different AI agents out there in the world that you don't know much about and can't trust, then you want a relationship with them where you don't have to know as much about them. Just do they supply the service that you need? And you don't need to know how or why they did that. So a betting market is a way to do that with information, right? So say, for example, you have a big data set of stars and you want to find comets or something, right? You could authorize AIs to go find comets. You could say every comet you find will pay you $10,000. And then when AI comes up and says, here's my comet, if you could just look at the picture and go, yep, that's a comet, here's your 10,000. Now we're done. You don't have to know much about that AI. You don't have to know how it works or what its strategies were. All you have to know is that it did the thing you wanted. So that's an arm's length market relationship where you ask a supplier to do something, you can check the quality of what they've done. So a betting market is a way to do that for information. You ask a question and then you get answers without having to know much about the individual parties involved and what their strategies were, their motivations. You just basically set up the betting market, and you know that they have an incentive to bet only if they know more and to push the price to what they know the most about. And when you can do that, I recommend it. That is, but most AI projects are not of that form. Most AI customers are not of that form, right? Most people making an AI says, hey, they have thousands of people working under them, all assigned to do different tasks in the project, and then there's some central designer who has a concept and checks all the people against his concept to see that they've made a design according to their concept, and they have some testing suites. And then they go to customers saying, hey, we're Google or we're Apple or Microsoft, and you should buy us because look at this thing we have, and you should trust us because here's the test. And they're asking people to have trust and an evaluation based on knowing a fair bit about the partner that they have a relationship with, which is all fine. But then sometimes in the world, we just want to have a system where we don't have to know those things. So again, if you just want to know something about, will your project make a deadline? Or, will your customer introduce a competing product? Will your competitor introduce a rival product? Then one approach is just to set up a betting market and invite lots of people to participate. And then you don't need to know so much about why they're there, what they know. You can just look at the price, and that's the answer to your question. So that's the pitch for a betting market. Often it's illegal, and then it's often hard to get people interested in doing that. People are really used to this idea of, in an organization, I only hire people to do things when I trust them and I know them, and then I assign them a task, and then I can fire them, and I have a long-term relationship with them. It's often hard to get organizations to do what's called buy versus make. Make is when you do it inside the organization. Buy is when you get it from outside the organization. And organizations tend to have a bias to make over buying. But of course, often you just can get a better deal by buying than making. So a betting market is basically a way to buy instead of make.
So I take it, and I agree with this very deeply. What do you think is the sort of mental block for many institutions that's not stopping them from realizing this thing that seems seemingly obvious?
Well, turn it around. In organizations, managers present themselves as scientific decision makers with spreadsheets. They are calculating what's best for the company. In that image, they should be very interested in information because it's the central to what they do. So they need to present themselves as being interested in information and eager to get neutral, accurate information. In fact, most managers are not neutral scientific decision makers of spreadsheet. They are politicians. They are part of an alliance, and they need to support their alliance and its positions on various organizational issues. When you're a politician pretending to be a scientist, you have to pretend to be interested in neutral information, but in fact, you are not so interested in neutral information. As a politician, you're going to have your alliance, and your alliance is going to determine what things it's in favor of or not. And you don't want those things to fluctuate with last minute estimates on things. Okay. If your group has decided you want this project to go, then you just want it to go regardless of particular calculations of its cost benefit analysis, et cetera. So in organizations, people pretend to be interested in neutral information, but they are much less interested than they want to seem. They are actually interested much more in making alliances, being loyal, figuring out how to undermine their rivals. And therefore, in most organizations, if there's a forecasting department, it's really quite underfunded. And it's often very political in that sense that it'll give the organization whatever forecast people want to hear. It's quite flexible and available to tell you what you want to know. Because, in fact, people don't actually want to know that much. They want to have their alliances do things. So a concrete example of this is deadlines. Many organizations have projects with deadlines, and they quite often fail to make the deadline, and they lose a lot of money because of that. And they pretend like they want to know more about what would make the deadline happen or not, but they don't. So, in fact, interestingly, when people, say software managers, manage projects, often they're quite overconfident about what they can do on the projects. And then their managers, some can have a choice between an accurate forecasting manager or an overconfident manager. And their managers tend to prefer the overconfident manager to the accurate manager. Part of it is that an overconfident manager, when they find out that they are not going to be able to deliver what they promised, they often work very extra hard to deliver something, even if it's not what it's promised. And the higher level managers care more about that extra effort than they do about whether you make the deadline. And in general, managers often use deadlines and the chance of making them as motivation tool, independent of whether it's accurate. That is, people tend to work the hardest when there's a good chance that we'll make the deadline, but only if we work hard. So if you're pretty sure you will make the deadline or pretty sure you won't make the deadline, either case, you're not very motivated to work hard. It's only when you think you're at the edge of making the deadline that you work hardest. That's why managers often declare that you're at that edge, even when you're not. That is, they want to make their official estimates, make it seem like you're at that edge. Whether you're in fact pretty sure to make it or pretty sure not to make it is less important. So they don't want accurate forecasts for that purpose. They want these forecasts they can manage. And that's true for a lot of forecasting organizations. They are set for political reasons, for supporting an alliance or motivating people, and they aren't so interested in accurate forecasts, which is why they don't necessarily want prediction markets giving them accurate forecasts.
That is a near perfect response. I think that seems 100% accurate to me. So you consider prediction markets, and as do I to an extent, to be a very critical piece in designing long-lasting institutions.
It's a promising technology that should allow much better informed choices. That doesn't necessarily make organizations last longer. If you want long-lasting organizations, that's just a different set of criteria.
Better aligned, maybe.
Just better informed.
Better informed. Okay. Okay, so you worked on institution design at Caltech, and you spent 4 years getting your PhD there. And what happened afterwards?
Well, I went on the job market. I did better on the political science market than I did on the economics market, actually, because my work was overlapping both. But I didn't get a tenure track job in either. What I did get was an offer for a postdoc in health policy at UC Berkeley. So that's what I did for the next year, from 2 years, from 97 to 99. And in that process, I learned a lot more detail, and that's part of what they wanted. So I was a theorist before who just knew a lot of abstract theory, didn't know a lot of concrete details about parts of the world. This program was exactly intended to take a theorist like myself and tell them a lot of details about health policy so that I could then apply theory to health policy. And so I learned a lot of details, and what I learned was that the details didn't make much sense relative to the usual theory. That is, it just was all wrong. Like one particular thing was all wrong, was just there in fact is very little correlation between health and medicine. In our best randomized experiments, when you randomly give some people more medicine than others, they are not healthier. That's pretty much at odds with the usual theoretical stories about health and medicine. So
that's a very
I
big.
realized that there was just something worth thinking through here. And so I came up with a evolutionary psychology inspired story about how medicine is primarily a way that we show that we care about each other rather than getting healthier, which makes sense of a number of puzzles about medicine. And that introduced me to the idea that I then elaborated, say, in my last book, The Elephant in the Brain, that a lot of ways to explain puzzling phenomena in the social world is that we are just wrong about our motives. That is, we tend to say that some X is about Y, and it's not. It's about something else, some Z. And once you're willing to consider such hypotheses, then you can explain a lot more of the world by just saying, yeah, people say they go to the doctor to get well, but they just don't. They're just doing it for a different reason. And once you're willing to consider such different reasons, you can explain a lot of things in law and education and romance even, and a lot of other parts of our life. You'll just have a much richer and more promising set of theories to consider once you're willing to say people are just lying or wrong about why they do stuff.
And do you think that comes from us not understanding our own brain chemistry as well as we should, and assuming intention on parts of things that we can't control?
We're designed not to know a bunch of things about ourselves. So then you might ask, why are we designed not to know a bunch of things about ourselves? And then, so your conscious mind, the one talking to me, it tends to think it's in charge. It's running things in your mind. And the basic fact is it's more like a press secretary than the president. Okay. Basically, when there's a bunch of people asking the president what they're doing and why, the president doesn't answer. The press secretary answers. The press secretary doesn't really know why the president's doing things, and they don't really need to know. Press secretary's job is to make up some good stories that will answer the questions to people's satisfaction, but still make the president look good. And that's what your conscious mind is. It's not supposed to know the truth. It's supposed to present a good answer to make yourself look good to other people. And so that's why you don't actually know the truth about why you do stuff.
So you're saying in some sense there's this filter that we fail to acknowledge at times.
You just don't realize you are the press secretary. Your conscious mind is not the thing whose job it is to know the truth or be in charge. That's not what you are. You are the one whose job it is to put a good spin on whatever is happening.
Well, it seems like a very fundamental thing to me.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems if we make that error in decisions, and especially decisions that matter deeply, it seems like a very fundamental error to make.
You're not making the error in your decisions. You're making the error in your description of yourself. That's the whole point. You aren't deciding these things. You think you're deciding things and you're not.
Yeah, no, as a result of this sort of, I'm saying as a result of this idea, if we're making decisions in the real world, and those decisions are impacted by this belief that we're making it consciously, whereas there's this filter that's helping us make it, and we're not aware of that filter, is that not a very deep issue?
Well, so the key thing is you're making decisions in the world, and then you're justifying them with this rationale. And the rationale isn't actually affecting the decisions that much. So you're spinning the story to make yourself look good, but then you're not actually making your actions consistent with that story. If the story was driving your actions, you would have big problems. But you might notice it's not. You aren't actually making decisions that are very consistent with this story you tell about yourself. You're just telling the story, and people are hearing the story, and they're nodding, and they're agreeing with your story, and they're maybe accepting that it describes your behavior when it does actually not describe your behavior. And that's the same true for them. They're telling you stories about their behavior. which you're nodding and accepting, even though they don't actually describe their behavior. So our actual behavior makes a lot more sense in terms of our actual motives. But the stories we tell about them, they're the things that aren't fitting. But the stories we tell aren't actually fitting our behavior.
Wow. That seems like a very deep ontological question. That seems very, very deep to me. It seems as if it's something that is worth thinking about very deeply as an individual, if true. Is that something that you find yourself sort of battling as an idea?
You were not built to be honest with yourself and to know what you're doing and why. You were built to lie to yourself and to be ignorant about a bunch of things. You could now force yourself somewhat to be more honest about some things, but you have a limited capacity to do this. You need to choose carefully where and what you're going to try to be more honest about, and accept that it's going to be a limited fraction of all the things you do. Sorry, you were just outgunned here. You are just this conscious mind floating on a big sea of much more capable mind underneath that you can't see and can't overpower. But you might think carefully enough to be honest about something. So my first recommendation is just first look at other people, not yourself. Try to explain on average why other people are doing things. Why do they go to the doctor? Why do they go to school? Why do they vote? Once you come up with some rough estimates about why other people are doing things, if the question is why are you doing things, you should just assume you're probably a lot like them. Okay? No matter what your mind wants to tell you, no matter what you want to believe about yourself, you're probably a lot like these other people. Sorry. First, fix your mind on what they're like, and then accept that you're like them.
That sounds a lot like what I tell myself at my best and at my worst. I'm more or less the average, as is everyone around me. It's humbling in some sense, but it's also, I think this is somewhat of a deep issue. I'm not sure if it's something that you can overcome as long as we maintain the mammalian brain that we have today.
You can overcome it one at a time in limited scopes, but so say you're focused on, I don't know, grocery stores or something, right? It's a small part of your life, but maybe it's the focus of your professional expertise, grocery stores. You could be very honest about grocery stores, even if you're not honest about your marriage or your children or all the rest of your hobbies or the rest of your life. But if we put together your expertise on grocery stores with my expertise on hospitals and somebody else's expertise on chicken farms or whatever it is, we could come up with a coherent picture of how the world works that we can then share with each other, even if it's at odds with our intuitions about our own behavior. But if we're willing to just put aside our own intuitions and go, this is the expert network we put together, and he's the grocery store guy, and this is what he says about grocery stores, so I'm going to accept that, and he's going to accept what I say about hospitals, and we put together the story, then we can learn a lot together that way. It's just going to be somewhat separate from our own intuitions about our own behaviors.
Right. I'm going to sit on that. I'm going to meditate on that. I'm going to try to understand that at the depth that's required, and then hopefully apply it to certain parts of my life. So you did public health at Berkeley, and what happened afterwards? Where'd you end
So
up?
then I went on the market again to try to get a job, and this time I landed a tenure track job here at George Mason University, and so I came here, and that's where I've been ever since. So initially, I needed to get tenure, and that was a touch and go thing in the sense that I was tempted to be too diverse on all the different things I was studying and thinking about. My colleagues had to say, hey, you need to focus here and make sure you do enough to get tenure, which I squeaked by, in part because of a publicity event. That is, in 2003, I was working on this project for DARPA to create prediction markets for the Department of Defense. And two senators had a press conference where they denounced the Department of Defense for having these prediction markets, what they claimed were going to be betting on terrorism. And they said this was just an immoral, terrible thing to do, to bet on terrorism. And therefore, once they made this claim in front of a press release, immediately the next day, the Secretary of Defense announced in front of Congress the project was killed. in that day, nobody asked us if the accusations were correct. They made the accusations on a day where DARPA PR person happened to be unavailable, probably not coincidentally. And basically, that killed the project. But then there was a lot of press about it over the coming months, press in which was mostly favorable to the project in the most, in the expert press, or the ones that pay the most attention to the details. My colleagues here at George Mason Department of Economics liked the idea that I was getting bad press defending markets, which they love. And so that helped me get tenure here at George Mason.
That's a remarkable story. But I don't know where to go with that one, but that's like, so you've actually tried to implement some of these ideas for
Sure.
DARPA. And was it actually, were you guys actually, I say this jokingly, of course, but were you guys trying to bet on terrorism, or what was it?
So it was mainly going to be markets on countries in the Middle East and their various political and economic and military actions and their interrelations. We had a sample of the website that was going up to give people an illustration, and in that thing we gave a miscellaneous section. In the miscellaneous section we had a North Korea missile launch and an Arafat, who was a Palestinian leader, being assassinated. And that was the basis of the claim that we were having a market on terrorist attacks. Just two items in a miscellaneous category on this website. But
and that killed the whole program.
Right. But again, so an interesting thing about moral violations is people are expected to have immediate opinions on accusations of moral violation. They're not expected to have time to go look it up and figure out their answer. So basically, when somebody accuses you of a moral violation, the easy thing to do is just agree with the accusation. If you say it might be true, might not, give me some time to go look it up and research it, then they'll think you're a slacker, you're an immoral person because you need time to think about this. You should just agree with me immediately. This is bad. So that played out here in the sense that people felt a strong pressure to have an immediate opinion that this was bad and to denounce it, and therefore hardly anybody checked if the accusations were true.
Wow.
And this is the sort of thing that mobs do often.
Yeah, but I mean, this mob, if we'll term it like that, is the Defense Department.
This mob was the whole US media world of public discussion. That is, the Department of Defense had funded the project, but then two senators at a press conference, and then I have a statistical analysis of press on this topic that I think had like 800 media articles on the topic. So there was a lot of media on it over the following 6 months or so. And so I did an analysis of all those articles, but there was a lot of discussion. So it was that discussion that, induced the Secretary of Defense to kill it.
Interesting. Too much bad press in some sense.
Well, the immediate consensus of the talking heads with this was a bad thing. It was only over time that the consensus would be reversed. But often it's the immediate consensus that matters. The reversal of opinion on reflection doesn't really matter
at all. I agree. And so you started in 2003 at GMU at George Mason.
2000. That was the project was in 2003. Hit the bad press. I started at George Mason in 1999, 4 years before that.
Okay.
And then I got tenure in 2006. You see, a few years after.
Okay, because they loved the idea of this
senators denouncing me for something they would support.
That says a lot about GMU.
Yes, or at least my department.
Your department. Who, and so what did you spend the rest of your time there working on? What are some of the things that you felt? You've written a very interesting book called The Age of M, which came very much later in your career, about 10 years later after
I had been thinking about that stuff for a long time, but finally writing a book on it came later.
Right. So
once I finally got tenure, then I was able to sort of spread out onto these other topics that otherwise it would be unwise for me to focus on when I'm trying to get tenure.
Yeah.
So for getting tenure, I focused on game theory models of information aggregation, adverse selection, and some other institutional issues. That was the main area I did my work, which is, in technical theory journals in economics and decision theory. But then I have all these other interests that I've pursued since then that are different. So, for example, there's this phrase, the great filter. And I introduced that in a 1998 article, while I was still in, the postdoc at Berkeley, about describing it. Now that's since then become a widely spread use. There's a Knuskard video on it from 5 years ago that has 26 million views. So that's a widespread use concept. But at the time, I was just a grad student and the idea slowly spread. And I've only once ever been invited to give a talk on the top subject. And I'd never published it in a respectable journal.
The great filter.
Right.
That's something I've heard Elon talk about too.
Okay, but nevertheless,
1999. That's way before.
1998, actually.
1998.
So that's 25 years ago now.
Do you mind giving us sort of the debrief on what that is? And
so the concept is just that we hope to be advanced in the near future and spread amongst the stars. And what we expect to do is we expect to be pretty visible from a long way off. We look around, we don't see anything. That's often the Fermi's question, where is everybody? We can rephrase that question as, well, there's a universe full of these empty planets. They start out dead. Slowly, they could go through a set of stages and processes where life advanced farther along to eventually where it might reach our stage and eventually might reach the visible change. We have this huge universe that we can see that nothing like we hope to become is visible. It must be really hard to go along this process. Almost all the things that try to go down this path don't make it to the end, at least by now. That's the great filter. The great filter is that difficulty of going down that process. And one way to think about it is we are now at a certain point along that path. We aren't all the way to the end. And so there's the question of where the biggest part of the filter is, it behind us or ahead of us? If a lot of the filter is ahead of us, then we will face a very difficult time in achieving this thing we think might seem to be pretty easy, to become visible in the universe. Because the filter, if there's, say, a factor of 1,000 filter, that says we only have a 1 in 1,000 chance of doing that. 999 out of 1,000 times we're going to fail. So that's pretty serious thing to worry about.
I think very serious. And does this sort of tie into your idea of Grabby aliens? And
Grabby aliens is just a mathematical model of the great filter. It's a way to precisely estimate numerically what you otherwise would have said is just a big number. Who knows how big and what
it's a technical
made of. Right. So we have a 3-parameter model of where aliens are in space-time. And we can fit each of those parameters to data we have so that we can say that we have a roughly estimated version of this model. And then we can ask that model the answers to our big questions. How far away are the nearest aliens? When would we meet them if we moved out to meet them? And the answers are Grabby aliens, the sort that would expand into the universe until they met other Grabby aliens. They expand at roughly half the speed of light or something like that. Very fast. They arise roughly once per million galaxies. Very sparse. They arise around now, that is, at the moment, half the universe is full of Grabby aliens. Half the volume of the universe is occupied by them. We are roughly halfway through the process of them filling up the universe. And if we start to expand out, let's say half the speed of light to meet them, we would eventually meet them in 1 billion years. And that's the answer to where are the aliens in space-time. They're a long way away. They're out there. They've filled up half the volume now. But because they're so far away, even though they're going enormously fast, it'll still be 1 billion years till we meet them.
So the great filter is, in some sense, this idea suggesting that is it suggesting that there's something left for us to understand as to why it is that we don't see them so abundantly? Or do you feel as if this Grabby aliens model is an answer to...
Well, it's a summary of the answer. That is, it says that, so basically on each planet like Earth, life has to go through a number of hard steps, each of which is very difficult, that takes a long time before it can get to the next step. And part of the model here is how many steps are there?
Yeah.
And the answer is about 6. So we have gone through 6 steps here and therefore are close to being able to expand. And other planets out there, they have to go through steps, and that's why it's so rare. The great filter is the fact that you have to go through these 6 really hard steps before you can become Grabby. I mean, there might be another step after here, but it would be a different sort of these are try steps where you can just keep retrying. There can be other steps where you just have to get it right the first time, otherwise you fail. So we might have more of those steps in front of us, but we don't have any more of the try steps.
Interesting. And so you say you mentioned that they expand at half the speed of light.
Roughly.
What, and I know that, I'm not sure if you've met any aliens, but
Nope.
What does that mean when them expanding at half the speed of light? When you sort of try to think of that in literal terms, what would that mean to you?
So there's some origin they have, and they're leaving that origin in all directions as fast as they can go. So literally there's going to be, little ships or seeds that are flying along. Sometimes they smash into something and they can't make it, but eventually most of them make it to some destination. When they are the first thing to arrive at that destination, then they land somewhere and start to grow, try to make more resources, build up an infrastructure. At some point, they convert that into making more seeds that shoot out and fly to the next place. And they go so fast between these oases that the time spent waiting at each oasis to grow is small compared to the time they are flying between them, so that the average speed might be half the speed of light.
That's very precise. Okay, so yeah, I've never heard anyone put it like that. That's I need to digest that idea for a little bit. But do you think of these as being sort of von Neumann probes that are going out, or it doesn't really matter what they are?
They are reproducing.
Yeah.
They're literally landing somewhere and making a lot more copies of themselves. So they are certainly reproducing probes. Almost surely they can fit a lot of information into each probe. They don't have to be dumb. They could be the equivalent of a whole city's worth of aliens in each probe. But they are primarily designed to go fast, to zoom out as fast as possible, to grab things, because they're probably in some local competition with each other. Whoever gets somewhere first gets to grab it and make research about it. The second one to come along, it's tough luck. It's already taken.
It'd be very similar to sort of the competitive dynamics of countries.
So I have a whole paper analyzing the game theory of this. And you can look up the paper, and then I have a qualitative summary of it called The Hardscrabble Frontier, where I describe what this dynamic process is like. But basically, this is a way to understand what they're doing at the frontier of this expanding wave and why it's going so fast.
Interesting. And so do you find how pressing of an idea do you think it is that we should be focused on understanding whether there's aliens out there? Do you think that's something that humanity should be devoting 1%
I mean, once you think the nearest alien is a very long way away and we won't meet them for a billion years, it becomes much less of a pressing issue. Now, it's possible there are other aliens much closer than that if UFOs are actually aliens. And so it's worth thinking through that possibility. But if that's not true, then they're just a long way away. But regardless of how far away they are, there is this key question: will we want to become Grabby? Will we become Grabby? So we are now a quiet alien. We are not expanding. There's going to be rarely these Grabby aliens who expand out in the universe. And then plausibly some aliens choose not to be Grabby. They decide against that. And so it's worth thinking through why, and then whether we want to do that. So you might think it's obvious, of course, a self-respecting civilization would want to expand and take over all the stuff it could, but it's not as obvious as you might think, because in the last century, for example, the world has become a more integrated world community where we decide things together by discussing them instead of just fighting over them. And many people like that. Many people like the world we've become by, having a global consensus of status and who to listen to and influence about all coming to agree on things. And arguably that's going to make our world go better in terms of global warming and innovation and war and other conflicts. Our world is gaining some substantial benefits by being an integrated whole. And in the future, it will be possible for some parts of the world to create strange artificial intelligence or to evolve strange descendants. And then the other world might be able to say, no, you can't do anything you want. You're in this world where world opinion matters, and we're going to say no to some of these things you want to do. And many people will like the fact that we have this world community that says no to many things. We don't allow all possible evolution and technology that could be disruptive and compete with us and disrupt us. We are going to together decide which technologies we approve when. That could go on for several centuries now, but at some point, when it becomes possible to send out probes and colonists to other stars, if we allow that, that will be the end of that era. Once colonists go to other stars, humanity will no longer be able to talk about things together and enforce its collective will on the individuals about what we want to happen. Colonists who go off to other stars can and will evolve into strangeness. They can and will fight and compete with each other. That will be the universe and of our civilization if we allow anyone to leave. And that's why some people might not want to allow it.
See, the interesting tangent, but so I'm guessing this is a deeper question for you in sort of posing the idea that perhaps we're getting to a stage where it's worth considering whether we want to make the moral decision as humans of whether we want to expand in that way or if we want to pick a different alternative. So would I be correct in assuming it's a way, it's giving us sort of a path by which we can think about this before we go ahead and do it?
It just seems like it is a choice we will make.
Yeah.
And it's in some sense the most important choice we'll ever make. I can't presume that my opinion on this will weigh very heavily on our civilization, but I can at least help us start to think about it. I can point out the choice, point out that it's coming, and start to collect the various arguments and positions that people will have on it for people's review. That's a role I can play in the world, is to be one of the first people to maybe highlight and initiate this discussion about what do we want to do.
Yeah, one of the things that I find amazing about some of these ideas that you have are there are certain people who produce ideas that seem to be one of one that are just it's just so distinct in a category of people that I find it incredible. I've never heard of anyone speak of anything even close to Grabby aliens or models that are actually predictive in that sense, or this great filter prior to that. So something else that you talk about is the age of M. What is the age of M, and what does that imply for us?
A common speculation in science fiction and futurism for a long time is the idea that we could make artificial versions of human minds. Human minds are now in this squishy bio, computer. We could transfer the software that's in our heads into a different kind of computer. And then in that different kind of computer, it would again run the software there. And then that thing would then feel like us and experience what we would have experienced here, except it can have some advantages in this new environment. It could be immortal. It could run at different speeds. It could make copies of itself. A whole new range of possibilities open up for this new emulation. So if I am a human brain, an emulation of me that would act the same in the same situations, I call an M, short for emulation. And at some point, it'll be possible to make M's and emulations, and then there'll be this world full of them. And the question is, when might that happen? But more interestingly, what would happen when that happens? So I felt like other people hadn't really been addressing the question of what would that world be like. I realized I could apply a lot of economics and understanding to work out the consequences of that world. And so that's what my book, The Age of M, does, is work out what happens in a world of these brain emulations.
That is probably one of the single most fascinating ideas I've ever come across. Would you consider that sort of being the metaverse, but with us having uploaded our minds? In some sense, are we already on the path to that world?
Well, I think that's actually a separate issue. That is, we can right now sit in a metaverse and experience it. Emulations can also sit in the metaverse, but the emulations can be in our real physical world just like we can. it's a choice of either of us how much attention to spend to a metaverse versus the physical world around them. I predict they will spend a fair bit of time in the metaverse, but not in a abstract fictional world. That is, so in you and I can see behind you, you have red walls, right? Behind those red walls are pipes and plaster and wires. They're very practical and physical things. You know they're there. You're not fooled about that, but you don't want to see them. What you wanted to see is red walls. So you're in a artificial visual world. That is, you made the walls in your room be what you wanted them to seem. They're not natural. They're not what would have been there without you. They are what you chose to be there. That's a virtual world. You are in a virtual world because you have made your world what you want it to be, and you had a lot of control over how it appeared. But it's not a fake world. It's a real world. It's the world you do your work in, the world you live in. It's a world facing real constraints. That, there's real volume constraints of where it can be, et cetera, but it's convenient to you and pleasing for you to make it look the way you want. Future emulations will live in a virtual reality, but it won't be a fake fictional world to them. It'll be like how the paint on your wall is. They'll sit at a desk and do work, and it'll be real work, but they get to choose how their room looks. And that's just a luxury that they get even more than you, because they'll make it easier for them to make their room however big and look however they want to them. They'll have fewer constraints on how they decorate and structure their world than you do for yours, but it won't be any more fake or imaginary for them than yours is for you. You're both in the real world doing real things that really matter. It's just you have more freedom about how you make things around you appear.
Right. And if I had to guess, I would assume energy would be one of the constraints. But what are some of the other constraints you think people in this emulated world might have to live in?
Well, every brain emulation needs to be made out of computer hardware. It needs to get energy and dump heat. It needs some maintenance. Those all cost real resources. So it'll have to do real work to pay for those real resources. And in fact, because it's so easy to make emulations, this is a more Malthusian world where most of the workers are living near subsistence level, working hard barely enough to pay for enough to survive and exist in this world. So this is not a world of luxury fantasy lives in a virtual reality universe of adventure and fiction. It's a world of people at the edge of existence struggling to survive.
Right. And so you're assuming this will be the lower sort of portion of humanity that'll go into these emulated worlds, and not, so you don't think there'll be like elites who move into these emulated worlds?
I'm sure there will be elites in this new world, just like there were in the past, but just like in the past, when most people lived near subsistence, there were a few elites that were much richer. That will also be true in this world. It's not most of them. It's a small fraction.
And you think we'll still have an economic system? We'll still have currencies?
Sure. That is, all the reasons for economics still continue in this world. The reason why we have economics isn't some strange ideology or something. It is markets in our world are productive and useful. Factories or firms, networks of experts, all of these things exist because they are functional and useful, not because there's some strange fantasy. So as long as they continue to be useful in the future world, those things will continue to exist.
And should we assume that these worlds haven't been created by other civilizations already?
Why would I assume that? That is, again, an advanced alien civilization. So when we meet an alien civilization, it'll be in a billion years. The ones that are existing out there right now, probably on average, are already a billion years old. A billion-year-old civilization has long since become artificial. At one point, they made brain emulations and AIs, and then they spent another billion years evolving into whatever they become. So it's maybe hard to say what it is, but it's almost surely artificial. They've long since given up their initial squishy original bodies and structures.
And are you willing to consider that perhaps time flows very differently for them within their simulated worlds. And so it might, it might not be that it's a billion years that we have to wait to meet them, but since they've spent, what's the equivalent of a billion years in our world in time?
Well,
So it's a
so
day in their
again, in the
day.
brain emulation world, they can speed up. So the subjective time is different than the objective time. I'm just talking about a billion objective years. I'm not talking about the number of subjective years. That could be
Yeah,
very different. In
yeah,
fact, there'd just be a wide variation. Some of the ones would have had a very small number of subjective years, and some of them would have enormous numbers of subjective years.
interesting.
But
And
it's
so
the
what do
objective billion years when we meet them. That's the number we can agree on.
yeah. So do you think that, there's you touched on it a little bit earlier, this sort of UFO conversation. What do you make of it as a person? How do you interpret it?
Well, I'm running out of time here, so you can
Okay.
decide if that's the last topic you want us to talk about.
That and then one last short question, and that'll be it.
Okay, so in my mind, the UFO question is the usual Bayesian analysis. There's a prior and a likelihood. The likelihood is about looking at particular UFO reports and asking which of the theories we might have of UFOs would be the best explanation for those reports. That's not something I'm an expert in, although I might just say the delusions explanation doesn't work for many of them. Like there's something really happening, whatever it is. It's not just a mistake or delusion to explain the most dramatic events. But my expertise is a lot higher about the priors. The main categories of explanation for UFOs are it's really aliens, it's some other advanced civilization that's Earth originated, it's a big hoax, and some organization is like making people lie and faking stuff to get us to believe their stuff, or finally, it's just mistakes and delusions. Those are the four main categories. And doing an analysis of Grabby aliens, I can actually speak to the prior on the aliens hypothesis. And when I do an analysis there, I say the prior on aliens is roughly 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000. Prior probability that aliens would be here. That might seem low, but it's much higher than, say, the usual 1 in a million prior for a murder accusation. So that means you got to listen to the evidence. Just like in a murder accusation, if there was, you should listen to the evidence and consider it to judge. With UFOs, you got to look at the evidence to judge if it's true. You can't just dismiss it on the basis, oh, that's crazy. It's unlikely, but not crazy. The odds are high enough that you have to look at the evidence. So that's my contribution to UFOs, is just to say, you got to look at the evidence. You can't just dismiss this. You have to engage the details of the actual reports in order to decide if it's real.
Interesting. Well, sort of my last question, and the question that I love asking everyone, is what is, in your perspective, the single most valuable idea on Earth right now?
Well, I mean, I think I have to go with this thing that's been the focus of my career, which is this idea that our biggest problem is failing to aggregate information. And we do know of an institution that does a great job of that. If only we could do more small scale trials to show that it works to spread it to larger uses. We have a biggest problem that we know how to solve. If only we would explore and develop that solution.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful idea, and one I hope to explore personally, but also understand much more about. Professor Robert Hanson, I want to say thank you so much for gracing me with your time. This has been extremely interesting to me, and I feel as if I've learned more in this single conversation than I have in a couple years of college.
Well, it was nice talking to you, and maybe we can talk again sometime.
Wonderful. This has been an honor for me. Thank you so much.
All right.